There are new rumors around Trey Murphy and the draft. And meanwhile, the Knicks coaching change could unexpectedly impact New Orleans, not in the way you think. It's the Wednesday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Wednesday, and we got a lot of ground to cover in today's show. Rumors about Trey Murphy III, a couple of draft prospects that are rising up draft boards you need to keep an eye on. We're then going to get into the Knicks firing their head coach, Tom Thibodeau, and the impact it could have on New Orleans. No, not Tibbs coming to New Orleans, but I'm going to give you a funny stat there. And then we're going to get back to a little bit of draft talk, looking at Jeremiah Fears and what the Utah Jazz are going to do at the 5th pick. So like I said, we got a lot to cover in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. So let's dive into all of this. So we're going to do some trade and draft rumors here at the top of the show, and the starting one being Trey Murphy III. You know, the Denver Nuggets have emerged as the betting favorite for Trey Murphy III. Now, I don't want you to think much of that, and we talked about this on the show the other day. You absolutely, under no circumstances, want to spend that much time looking at those, betting lines for those type of players. It's just designed to generate money. And I wouldn't say that that's like anyone really knowing anything. And it's just trying to kind of guess. So the Denver Nuggets being the favorite to land Trey Murphy, just like the other day, the Mavericks were the favorite to land Herb Jones. I don't really buy into anything with that. The other day on the show, we talked about how the Pelicans having no untouchables, does not mean they're actively shopping anyone. There's a big difference between listening to offers and not, and then being like, give me your best because we want to trade this guy. Like maybe they're doing with Zion or not, right? At HP Basketball on Twitter, Matt Moore, he's one of the hosts of our Locked On Nuggets show. He also works for the Action Network. He puts out his Substack and his newsletter, and he talks about this. This is fact-finding season in the NBA. And that's why I said on Monday's show, looking at that there are no untouchables in that report is a great thing. That means that Joe Dumars is doing exactly what he should be doing. So I love hearing that report right off of the bat. So that's good. But it doesn't mean that any of these players are going anywhere. Same person at HP Basketball is host of Locked On Nuggets. Nuggets are the betting favorite, according to, I don't even know what sportsbook it was. He said he's been digging around and he has not heard anything credible to Trey Murphy going to Denver at all. And basically said, yeah, you have to make one of those offers that New Orleans just can't say no to when it comes to Trey Murphy. That's going to be at least 2 draft picks, if not 3. If you think that's crazy, maybe you're a fan from another team. I'm sorry. Look, he was drafted at 17. If you're clamoring for him and you're going to trade New Orleans a draft pick for it, Pelicans have to hope that draft pick is going to be better than Trey Murphy. Otherwise, you don't trade Trey Murphy, right? I talked about this the other day when it comes to draft picks, and I think sometimes fans throw them around a little bit too frivolously, being like, here's 2. Well, if they're in the 20s, your chances of getting a good player are not great. So if you're not going to get a player better than Trey Murphy, why would you move Trey Murphy? Especially if they're not trading Zion. If you're resetting the timeline, that's one thing. But as of now, Zion Williamson is still on the team. We'll look at him actually more tomorrow in the podcast, and he's extension eligible. I want to kind of get into that a little bit. So if Matt Moore is kind of shooting this down pretty close to the Nuggets, I don't really think there's any fire behind the smoke. And again, New Orleans is just doing proper due diligence in trying to find out what the value for these players are. So let's get into some draft notes here that I think are worth mentioning and relevant to the Pelicans here. And let's go to the second overall pick. Our Locked On NBA Big Board podcast also puts out a newsletter on Substack. That one's really great. And Rafael Barlow in that said, the only lock in this draft, the only certain thing is Cooper Flag at number 1 overall. After that, it's open. We do think that the Spurs will take Dylan Harper. And from talking to league executives and others, agents and things like that, he says, everyone's expecting the Spurs to take Dylan Harper. Scouts view it differently because of course they do. They don't see the fit there, so they think something's going to be different because, the fit isn't great with the guards that they have. But if they're just going to go best player available, the value pick, that's still Dylan Harper. So basically what this is saying, and maybe this is the message the Spurs want out there, keep that in mind, right? This is silly season when it comes to it. Trust nobody. If you want Dylan Harper, you're going to have to try and trade up to 2, and that means you're going to probably have to give up a lot. Not great if you wanted Dylan Harper on the team like I really did. So let's look at 2 prospects that are really rising upwards. And let's start with Yegor Demine from BYU. He had a very good combine, did not play 5-on-5 there, but his pro day there was really good in terms of shooting. His size and those kind of measurables came back really, really well. He's rising up draft boards. I think when you look at this, and we'll revisit this a little bit more in the third segment when we talk a little bit more about the draft, particularly with the 5th pick and then Jeremiah Fears and how that kind of maybe makes things play out. I don't see Demine rising into the top 5, but he's probably a top 10 pick at this point in time. I don't know if the Pelicans want to go for him at 7, but it might depend on who's available. But that seems to kind of be right around his draft range. And he's worth keeping an eye on if maybe one of the top guards isn't available. And when you kind of look at this league, it's very much point guard, lead guard driven, I think, for the most part. And that is something the Pelicans are lacking, especially when you factor in that injury to DeJounte Murray. So he's a guy that rising up draft boards could be a very intriguing option for the New Orleans Pelicans. We've talked about him a bunch so far here on the show. Another prospect who I really like and is very much rising up is Maxime Reynaud from Stanford, a senior there. I want to talk more about him later in the week. That might be a Friday show. He's a guy that I would absolutely either trade down for or back into the draft for. Look, if there's no one you love at 7 and maybe 2 picks is better than 1 pick, it might be worth trading back. And this seems to be a year where you could get extra value trading back. We'll look at that. But you could also probably easily trade back into the first round and maybe grab Reynaud, who's going to be somewhere in between, say, 14 and 25. It's got I could see him maybe even going 10, but he's got kind of that middle of the first round range. You could easily get back in there, and I'll explain what those trades would look like later in the week. So coming up next, the New York Knicks fire Tom Thibodeau. Would he be a good option here in New Orleans? No, I'll explain why, because it's kind of funny to look at the numbers behind it, but also it's going to have a potential impact on James Borrego. Let's break that down. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Betterhelp. Let's talk about something that doesn't get talked about enough: men's mental health. There's this pressure to always just keep it together, perform, provide, never show weakness. But the truth is, real strength comes from opening up and basically just taking better care of your mental well-being. Every year, 6 million men in the U.S. experience depression, and many go undiagnosed. But talking to somebody, a friend, a loved one, a therapist, can make a huge difference. And therapy isn't just for crisis moments. It's great for learning how to set boundaries, build healthy coping tools, and be the best version of yourself. Maybe you just want to be able to connect with your partner better in some capacity and have a better dialogue. Therapy can help you achieve all of that. I'm a big proponent of it. And with over 35,000 licensed professionals, BetterHelp makes it easy to find a therapist who understands you, and you can connect anywhere. It's for your convenience. So as the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. So talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/lockedonnba. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedonnba. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And for your second listen, check out the Locked On NBA Big Board show. NBA draft expert Rafael Barlow reacts to every workout, interview, and rumor leading up to the draft. Find Locked On NBA Big Board on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. So let's switch gears from the draft. We'll get back to the draft in the next segment here. But the New York Knicks firing Tom Thibodeau, their head coach, after just leading them to the best season they've had in 25 years. I can't say it's a shock, and truth be told, I kind of get it, but also don't get it. And this is something where you're seeing this be a trend around the league, right? You win Coach of the Year, you're going to get fired. Lead your team to the finals, you're probably going to get fired. Win a title, no job security there whatsoever. Just any success you have, it looks like European soccer at times with how they go through coaches. As an AC Milan fan, I saw it this year. So it's a surprise and not a surprise because, this is kind of like what's going on in the NBA right now. So I get it because that they don't look like a modern team, right? They kind of got on the run they did by just basically a two-man game between Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns for a really long time, but their offense did not look particularly good. They were also 27 in three-point attempts when you have a three-point shooting big man. Like, that just doesn't work. And that Celtics series they had earlier was very fluky. And, at one point, good on the New York Knicks for realizing that was probably not something that would regularly happen. And you shouldn't read too much into that series. Take the success, don't get me wrong, but that was probably not sustainable, repeatable every single year. So moving on from, if you realize that, that's good because that's a process over results outlook with it, which is usually a smart thing to do. However, and I've been hammering this point home for a while now, and it's something that I'm really, really buying into even more, and that is, the results do need to matter. If you're winning, you're winning. It's as simple as that. That's the end goal here, right? The goal is not build the best process you have possible. It's not build the best infrastructure you have possible. It's not even be the most sustainable. It's win games and win a title. And if you're doing that, that should matter. And you're seeing that not matter with guys like Taylor Jenkins, Michael Malone, even with their firings as well, and some of the other moves that we've seen. The results have to matter at a certain point, maybe more so than your process. But I get it, and that's why I get it and don't get it for the New York Knicks. The results were there. I've seen people say, like, why does, they fire Tom Thibodeau, but Willie Green still has a job? That is probably the Pelicans being too more process-oriented over the results, right? Normally you want that kind of thing. They haven't been healthy. He's probably overachieved as a head coach to a little bit, but also the results haven't been that good. Maybe you need to focus on that a little bit more. They did that by firing David Griffin. And look, we'll see what ends up happening with Willie Green here. But the way this impacts New Orleans is not, could they fire Willie Green and bring in Tibido if he's a good coach and available? I mean, you have other good coaches available and you're not making that move. And the immediate thing that I think everyone thinks here is, would he just run this team and or Zion Williamson into the ground, right? And that's kind of like the big thing because it's pretty funny. One of my good friends has a season ticket next to me. Shout out Jeremy here. Texted into a group text. Thought experiment. How many games would Pelicans day one starters miss due to injury if Tibbs took the NOLA job and did things the Tibbs way with regards to minutes and rotations? He goes, does Zion hit 21 games? So I was genuinely curious if you took the minutes and all of that, what would that look like? This is just a fun little thing. There's no real logic behind this. This is not scientific. Don't read too much into it, but it's kind of funny. Zion Williamson averages 1,342.8 minutes per season. Let me pull up the Knicks minutes this year. Tibbs is known for just leaning on his starters, playing them a ton. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that, right? Josh Hart led the league at 37.6 minutes per game. Mikal Bridges was 37. OG Anunoby, 36.6. Jalen Brunson, 35.4. Karl Anthony Towns, 35. Like, those are kind of insane numbers. That's in the regular season. Anunoby was over 39 minutes. So was Bridges in the playoffs. Josh Hart was coming off the bench, right, and played 35 minutes. The total minutes here, they had 6 guys who played more than, basically, let's call it 1350 is the Zion minutes per game. Bridges played over 3,000 minutes, which is a wild thing to actually see here. Josh Hart played almost 2,900 minutes. 2,000 is often a lot of minutes. All right, Zion plays 1,350 minutes per season. If you play him at like 40 minutes per game, we're rounding up to closer to the playoff number, so it's not exactly right. That's about like 33, 34 games for him if you just kind of used his average minutes. Again, not scientific, injuries and stuff have played a factor into that. But, oh boy, would Tom Thibodeau be like the wrong coach here with kind of wearing these guys down and the injuries that could come from it. Funny thing to think about for a second, though. I agree with that. But the Knicks are now looking for a new head coach. James Borrego is going to be one of the names that pops up, right? Linked with the Phoenix Suns job earlier this offseason. Not going to get that one. Linked with the Los Angeles Lakers and came very, very close, from what I've been told, to landing the Cleveland Cavaliers head coaching job before he pulled out of the running for that one. Maybe he realized he just wasn't going to get it. Who knows? So he's going to be in the running for this one. You know, I think everyone's looking at Michael Malone as the natural guy for New York. I get why, but I think there's a lot of similarities there when it comes to Tom Thibodeau in terms of stubbornness, shorter rotations, clashing with the front office. Is that the direction they necessarily want to go? I'm not entirely sure. Could, though. By the way, Michael Malone is a CAA guy. Leon Rose, who runs the New York Knicks, former CAA guy, they basically only sign CAA guys. Worth keeping in mind there with that connection too. I'm actually not sure who reps James Borrego, but or at least not off the top of my head. So he's going to be in the running for it. Will he get it? I think he'll have a good chance. If they don't want to go with like one of the big name head coaches there for whatever reason, I think Borrego is absolutely going to be in the running for that job, and you'll see his name linked to it very soon, if it's not already by the time I publish this podcast. That's how it's going to impact the Pelicans, is it could lead to Borrego leaving, not having anything to do with Tom Thibodeau coming to New Orleans. And I don't even think they'd bring him in as an assistant coach. He's more of a defensive guy. You have Jaron Collins, who's running your defense and has done a very, very good job of that. So I think that's why there's just not much there when it comes to the Pelican side of things, other than, losing an assistant coach I think they would like to keep. Let's switch back to the draft. Jeremiah Fears, I mentioned some other risers. Fears is very much rising. How does then, if he gets taken 5th overall, things play out for New Orleans? That's where it gets kind of interesting. Let's look at the Utah Jazz in the draft. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by OpenPhone. If you're running a business, you know that every missed call is money left on the table. Think about the last time you had an urgent need, maybe a plumber, a service provider. If the first person didn't answer, did you wait? Probably not. You probably just moved on to the next, company that you found. That's why you got to have OpenPhone. OpenPhone is the #1 business phone system built to streamline and scale your customer communications, all from an app on your phone or computer. OpenPhone lets you manage business calls and texts from a single app, and the shared inbox feature is a game changer. Your team can jump into any conversation instantly without missing a beat, and their AI agent handles after-hours calls, answers common questions, captures leads, so you're never going to miss a customer. Look, the other day I needed a service. I called 1, 2, 3 places. They didn't answer. I didn't leave a voicemail. I wasn't going to wait for them to call me back. I just kept calling until I found someone. Got someone, it got it done, and those first companies lost the business because of it, right? OpenPhone is offering Locked On Pelicans listeners 20% off your first 6 months at openphone.com/LockedOnNBA. That's OPENPHONE.com/LockedOnNBA. And if you have an existing number with another service, OpenPhone will port them over at no extra charge. OpenPhone, no missed calls, no missed customers. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube. And if you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. And for your second listen, it's Locked On Saints. Ross Jackson's looking at the QB battle with Tyler Shuck. By the way, Derek Carr is officially retired. He's going to break it all down over at the Locked On Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make them your second listen today. So let's start to wrap up the show by going back to the draft here. Jeremiah Fears, point guard, a guy I'm very high on in this draft, really rising. Turns out other people are very high on him as well. I'm not sure he's going to be there at 7. You know, I'm really curious what the Utah Jazz are going to do. They just hired Austin Ainge, Danny Ainge's son, away from the Boston Celtics to do some, I forget what his exact job title is, but high-level front office work, let's call it. You know, when I think he put out a statement where he talked, I saw the quote, basically saying like, we're not going to tank again next season. They're looking to compete. What does that mean in this draft? I don't think Jeremiah Fears is necessarily, I think he could, really going to help you right away. Like be an impact player in terms of winning next season. So does that mean you go for a Con Knipple there? Like the Utah Jazz at 5 are maybe where you could argue the draft starts, even though there's some uncertainty at 2, 3, and 4. You know, if they draft Jeremiah Fears at 5 after taking Isaiah Collier, in the first round just a year ago, that pushes down Trey Johnson, Con Knipple. I would imagine the Wizards would draft Trey Johnson there, leaving Con Knipple to New Orleans, but maybe they're concerned about Trey Johnson, and if he's there at 7, New Orleans should jump on him. The Pelicans look like they could easily like one of these 3 guys would be available in Jeremiah Fears, Trey Johnson, and Con Knipple. So that's kind of interesting, right? Con Knipple's probably the safest out of all of those guys, but maybe has the lowest ceiling out of all of them. But if you're looking for a guy that's going to help you win games right away, that's Con Knipple. Then the Wizards are looking at Jeremiah Fears or Trey Johnson, and that's an ideal scenario for the New Orleans Pelicans here. But if they draft Fears 5, that becomes a bit of a disaster because I would, again, imagine the Wizards would take Trey Johnson at 6 right now. But them saying they don't plan to tank, that's kind of interesting to me. Do they then maybe look to move that pick for an established veteran to pair with Lauri Markkanen? I think that's potentially, on the table as well. No one has any idea what the Utah Jazz are looking to do. Right? Maybe they're looking to compete. I thought it was interesting that, David Locke of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, who also hosts Locked On Jazz. That's where the name comes from, by the way. I thought it was interesting that David Locke wanted to trade for Zion Williamson, kind of make that splash and go all in, and they were willing to give up the 5th pick in this draft for it. He is pretty clued into that team. I can confirm that. And so if they want to start, Zion's not going to be traded there anymore. Not that he was necessarily going to do that in the first place, right? Shamit Dua of the In the Know podcast was talking the other day. He talked to a couple people around the league and doesn't think Zion has any value in terms of draft picks or good young players, which, yeah, that kind of checks out, I think, a little bit with it. They want to do, people need to figure out what they're trying to do. Maybe they need to figure out, the Jazz do, what they're looking to do here and what direction that they're going to go. But I think if you look at kind of not a doomsday scenario, but what I would call not a great scenario for New Orleans, and this is going to lead to some discussion later in the week on the show. Say Jeremiah Fears goes 5, and maybe that means they're kind of tanking, but they're just not like going all in to compete just yet. Maybe they'll just try and compete, but not outright tank by shutting guys down. That's what that statement could mean as well, right? We're going to draft another guy. We just won't be good next year, but we're not going to try and lose games. The basketball gods do not like that. We learned this offseason. Jeremiah Fears goes 5. Trey Johnson goes 6 to the Wizards. And then what? Con Knipple at 7 to the Pelicans? You could maybe go Yegor Dimin then at that point in time if you really like that guy and decide he's the type of guard you want to build around and creator you want to build around. Cayman Malawach is there for New Orleans. I really like him, but he's going to need an elite guard to get him the ball. Otherwise, he's kind of wasted. I mean, you can find that guard later, but does that hurt his development for a first year? And there's some potential for that, I think. Is that an option where if it's Con Knipple at 7, do you then look to trade down and let someone else draft up and trade up and get the guy that they want? And I think there's a couple teams that wouldn't hate doing that. And so there's potential for that. When I say it's like a bit of a doomsday or not great scenario, is that means New Orleans is kind of then forced to choose, and we don't know what their draft board looks like. So this is kind of based off of my draft board, that you're not in an ideal situation there to kind of get a guy that you want that's going to help you right away, because this team is also trying to win. So you could get Fears, bring him off the bench. You don't need to start him, right? You can get Knipple, who's going to help you immediately, but doesn't have the highest ceiling. Maybe he does. I got to get the Locked On Blue Devils host on too, JJ Jackson, to talk about him, because he probably does. He's a tough one to kind of figure out, but maybe let's say they believe he doesn't have a high ceiling. That's a better way to put this. Then what do you do, right? That's where this gets, a little bit difficult with everything and not ideal. So what the Jazz do at 5 is really going to shape, in my opinion, a lot of the rest of the draft here. And, maybe if they do want to compete and take Con Knipple at 5, New Orleans is sitting pretty if you like Jeremiah Fears or Trey Johnson. Trey Johnson, I think, has one of the highest ceilings in the league in this draft if he hits it. I think he could easily be the best scorer out of this whole draft class. So the draft gets interesting at 5 with whatever the Utah Jazz are planning to do. We'll find out a little bit more. We'll try and get some intel on that and see if we can bring that to you here. So coming up in tomorrow, let's look at Zion and his future. There's a way the Pelicans can show they're building around him, and they should absolutely not do that under any circumstances. I'll tell you what that is in tomorrow's show. Friday, I want to look at trading down and then maybe trading back into the draft, even if you stay at 7 overall. I've got a couple trades in mind with that I think are pretty interesting and pretty good options. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I appreciate y'all so much for listening. We're going to be back tomorrow and the rest of the week with a lot to cover.